Well, I will open up our November meeting for the North Texas Archaeological Society. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jimmy Barrera. I'm the president of the society. And I appreciate everybody who's here in person and on Zoom. We have some general announcements to go through. So a lot of activity over the last month for this society, a lot. You know, I want to thank everybody who participated in the variety of events across our region and even other parts of Texas, but that was a heavy duty month for this society. So many of our members put in a lot of volunteer time at events all over, including the Fort Worth Nature Center and Refuge site tour that Brett Williamson and I led. That was fun. And then the Gainesville, Texas Archaeology Month event, TAM, that was led by Miss Jen Fricks and Dylan Polabar, and that was over the past month. Of course, the Texas Archaeological Society annual meeting, that was Tyler. And so that was quite a few of our members involved in co-hosting that event. And so many of our members were there to make sure that that event kicked off.
Hi, what isn't there a weight on right now?
I think you need to go and mute somebody, James. Just if you would.
Let's see, honey walnut, kapow, broccoli, orange, mushroom,
Ray.
Okay, cool.
and string beans.
Somebody's got to work on that.
The rest is waiting.
Do you guys have any super greens?
It'll be a little bit of a wait.
Okay. I'll take
Hold on, folks.
a bigger plate with orange.
There we go. So everybody on Zoom, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's make sure we keep our mics on mute on Zoom, please. That's going to help us over here keep on rolling. So I'm going to get back on it and we'll keep moving. Okay. Let me hide this thing that's kind of bothersome for everybody in the room. All right, so anyway, the Texas Archaeological Society annual meeting was quite an important event for this society as the co-host. We also had a lot of members who presented. So thanks everybody who was involved with that. The Clovis Field site continued investigations over the past month. That's Mills County. And our member, Chris Mice, is the lead and our point of contact for the Clovis Field site excavations. And then the Baku work days, which were located in Midlothian at Dr. Katrina Whitley's place, that also occurred over the past month. And that's working on the Baku site artifacts from New Mexico. Next month, no meeting. So this society never has a meeting in December or in June. So we have 10 meetings a year, not in December or June. But we are going to start the Christmas party again. So a lot of our members are familiar with that. But if you're a newer member, that's a great time to get together and just celebrate as a society, get to know folks. Typically, it's a potluck, and there are details in this month's newsletter. I'm sure they'll be published again next month. And if you want to attend, contact Dr. Paula Vastine. The North Texas Archaeological Society is donating $250, and this was decided by the executive committee to support Texas Beyond History. And how many folks are familiar with Texas Beyond History? It's a very important resource that we're fortunate to have here, that's hosted by the University of Texas. And so Texas Beyond History has a ton of information on archaeology and a lot of information for kids, K through 12 curriculum. It's received national awards. It's a very well-known resource, not only in Texas, but across the US. So they solicited the North Texas Society for support to help them continue marching on to really kind of revamp themselves for the next 20 years. They're at least 20 years old now. So we're asking for anybody who's interested to at least provide any sort of a donation, to consider that by going to our donation page on the website, or providing cash or check to Miss Gwen Durant, who's here in person. And any donations that are provided between now and November 30th will be added to the $250 that we're going to donate to Texas Beyond History. New members, welcome to our new members who joined since our last monthly meeting. And so then we have some events coming up, and starting on November 26th at the Caddo Mound State Historic Site. They're going to resume working on the grass house. And I forgot to add Dr. Victor Galan's email here, but I apologize. If anybody is interested, you could contact me and I will get you in touch with the folks to work on the grass house at the Caddo Mound State Historic Site. That's a very important project. We also have excavations resuming at the Clovis Field site December 10th and 11th. And Chris Mice is our point of contact. So if you're interested, if you haven't participated, I would advise. I know that conflicts with the North Texas Christmas party. I am aware, but you have an option for a Christmas party or go to the field. So we've got options. Then we have the Baku work days. So Dr. Katrina Whitley is continuing to work on the artifacts from New Mexico. So these are on Saturdays, and she's got a variety of artifacts and processes that you'll be exposed to. So if you want to learn about artifacts and how to process them in a lab setting, great opportunity, contact Dr. Whitley. And with that, I want to introduce our November guest speaker, Miss Bonnie Reynolds from SMU. Oh, right quick, James Everett has one announcement.
I may need the microphone.
Sure.
Not for the people here. I think the people in the room can hear me. I'm not sure about the Zoom folks. This, if I'm not mistaken, is Jimmy's last meeting to conduct as our president, at least the last monthly meeting. We'll have another executive committee meeting, but I wanted to take this opportunity to do a couple of things. The executive committee thought that it would be appropriate to give Jimmy a goodbye gift, a thank you gift. In fact, we did a couple of gifts for him. One that I know he really wants, and the other one I'm not sure about, but we'll find out. Now, the one I know he really wants was one of the books that we sold for the last 3 months here. And they were laid out here on these tables. And after we practiced and set up each meeting every month, I would hear Jimmy over there looking at this book saying, oh, yeah, I like that. But it probably cost too much for him. It started out at 70 cents and then it went to 30. It was $1 last month, and the executive committee agreed that really money was no object. Jimmy. So we came up with $1 and bought him this book that he really, really wanted. It's called Bluff Your Way in Archaeology. He's always wanted this, and now it will serve him well, I'm sure. So, Jimmy, on behalf of the community, enjoy the book. Now, you all know that I've done a couple of surveys with Jimmy this year. One of them involved driving 6 hours, and you get to know a person pretty well when you're driving that long. And I've always been impressed with Jimmy's knowledge of Texas archaeology and his knowledge of Texas archaeologists. He knows everybody in Texas who's in archaeology. So the Bluff Your Way is really just a joke. What we really want, at least in my opinion it is, what we really wanted to do, if you'll hold this just a second. Was give you a $100 gift card on Amazon. You can get whatever you would like, something really good or some things that are really good, and get something that will remind you of us every time you use it or wear it or look at it. So on behalf of the executive committee and the executive committee advisors, we have that, plus a card signed by everybody and incorporated into this 2-page document. So Jimmy, thank you very much for the leadership you've given us, for helping this organization more than double in size in the last 2 years and become the largest archaeological society other than TAS in the state. Jimmy, thank you very much. And by the way, I had told Bonnie I was gonna do this so that she would know that I wasn't just jumping in there without her knowledge. So now we can turn it over to Bonnie.
All right. All right, thank you, James. And yeah, I meant to state this will be my last meeting as president, so I appreciate that. We've got a great slate of officers coming in to take over for the next term, but it has been an honor. And I'll still be here. I'm here. I'm a member and I will be part of the society. So not going anywhere, just handing it over. And it's been wonderful. Thank you. So bye. I will come up here and we'll get it switched up. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. And I will share your talk. Get it set up.
Thank you. Oh my goodness.
There you go. Okay.
Does that sound good to everyone?
Can everybody in the room hear Bonnie?
Awesome.
Let me move that down. And then that should work.
I love it.
And
Thank
then
you.
if you want, you can clip that or just, stay in proximity.
Don't wander too far.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. As you said, my name is Bonnie Reynolds. I'm a PhD candidate at Southern Methodist University in my 7th year. Over the years, I have had the chance to meet and work with some of you at the TAS field schools or through my work as a research center at the SMU Archaeological Collections. And I really do hope that this dissertation is just the start in a long career in Texas archaeology for me. So tonight I will be presenting on my dissertation project, which does mean that I haven't finished collecting or I haven't finished all of my data analysis and writing all of my chapters. I am aiming for a May 2024 graduation date, but I will be able to take you through my project design and what I've done so far, which I'm actually really grateful for this opportunity because tonight is really kind of one of the first times that I'm able to talk about this dissertation work with so many people who are enmeshed in Texas archaeology and have worked at the sites that I'll be talking about and really kind of just know the area. So I do want to say that I would really appreciate any questions or insights or comments that you might have. And I did bring business cards in case anyone wants to contact me later, especially if you want to tell me about any large collections of Perdiz points that might be hiding out there. So this dissertation, I've broken it already. Oh,
Nancy,
yes, I
let's
would
see, sometimes we click on the screen, right?
love it. Thank you. So this dissertation, like I think most of you who have put together research projects before will know, started in a totally different place than it's ended up. But I wanted to take a quick kind of detour into this story because it also helps me explain how my project fits into the larger kind of compendium of archaeology projects in Texas. So in 2018, when I started developing this project, I had also just started working as a curator at the SMU Archaeological Research Collections. And the first project I was really kind of put in charge of was rehabilitating our artifacts from Kathleen Gilmore's San Javier excavations that she did when she was a master's student at SMU in the 60s. And I was super inspired by Kathleen Gilmore and really excited about the artifacts that we had in this collection. So the first drafts of my dissertation really focused on what life was like within those mission walls. But this being my first time really designing a research project, I then saw absolutely no problem in expanding my scope to all 30-ish missions that had been established in Texas. Luckily, I had a lot of really good advisors who talked me off of that ledge, but it did lead me to a really interesting realization, at least I think so, which is that we know a lot about how the Spanish planned their colonization effort to go. The Franciscan missionaries and the Spanish soldiers wrote prolifically about it. But we also know that there's a lot of variation in the longevity of each of the missions they established. So the San Javier mission complex lasted around 9 years before it was abandoned, and its supplies were used to establish the San Saba mission to the east. San Saba then operated for only 1 year before it was burned down in an attack by the Comanche and Tonkawa. Then 7 of the 9 missions established along the Gulf coast were closed and relocated closer to the protection of the San Antonio mission complexes after less than a decade. And in contrast to all of those missions, the El Paso and San Antonio ones were such long-lived settlements that the Spanish were able to establish large trading hubs and were eventually secularized into these large civilian settlements. But at every mission, we have the same, in our historical documents, we have the same kind of complaints coming out of every mission. So they're talking about disease, drought, lack of funding from the Spanish crown, corrupt soldiers, uncooperative indigenous populations, and no one of these problems was unique to any mission. In fact, even the San Antonio missions were complaining about the exact same things. And I really got inspired by the work of archaeologists like Kent Lightfoot and Lee Panich, who would argue that in order to understand why the Spanish colonial endeavor kind of unfolded the way it did across Texas, can only be found by looking outside of the mission walls and looking at the different Native American social, economic, and political contexts into which the Spanish were inserting themselves. The problem is that in Texas, we really can't agree on what the landscape looked like when the Europeans arrived. And this is because the archaeological record and historical records tell 2 pretty much separate stories. And in their 2012 book, Kanematsu and Arn call this the Toyah paradox. So the research I'm presenting on today actually goes all the way back to the 2 most basic questions, which are, who were the indigenous groups that were occupying Texas when the Spanish arrived, and how were they interacting? And I know that I'm speaking to a lot of people who have not only know a lot of this kind of background information, but have worked at these Toyah sites. But I think there's a lot of value in establishing that common groundwork before we get too far in the weeds. So as Maria told the Von Trapp children, let's start at the very beginning. The first thing we need to establish is that when I talk about the Toyah focus, this isn't the name of an indigenous group or a culture. It's actually just an archaeological category. The name Toyah was first kind of used as an archaeological term by J. Charles Kelly in 1947. When he sorted all the archaeological sites that really had been excavated in Texas up to that point into categories based on when the sites had been occupied and what artifacts they contained. So in Kelly's system, the Toyah sites were all of those occupied for a 500-year period that began just before and continued during Spanish colonization. And you can tell that you're digging at a Toyah site by the presence of 3 main artifact types: a specific shape of arrowhead called a Perdiz point, bone-tempered pottery, and evidence of bison hunting and processing. So a lot of bison bones and stuff like that. And then in the 70-ish years since Kelly created this definition of Toyah, there's been some awesome archaeological work to really tighten up this definition. For example, when Kelly believed that Toyah sites would only ever be found kind of in the central Texas Edwards Plateau region. But by 1986, so many new sites had been found that Stephen Carpenter was able to make a really successful argument for acknowledging that the Toyah focus actually covered most of the Toyah, Texas region. There have also been dozens of radiocarbon dates collected from Toyah stratigraphic layers. So we're actually able to create a really well delineated timeline for the occupation of these sites. But like overall, when you take a step back, what this definition and what this archaeological record is saying is that there's a 500-year period in Texas history where most of Texas was occupied by people making and using the same artifacts. And then on the other side of the Toyah paradox is the historical research. In the last 2 decades, as the internet has become more widely accessible and the storage capacities of computers have just grown exponentially, more repositories have been able to digitize their historical documents. And what this means is that we can now be sitting at A&M University in College Station, Texas, and be translating firsthand accounts of Spanish and French explorers that are physically stored at a Catholic repository in Spain, which is the exact scenario that archaeologists and historians like Mariah Wade were working in the early 2000s. And what these letters describe are dozens of distinct indigenous groups with their own names and their own languages who are actually only loosely connected by trade networks and treaties. And so herein lies the paradox. How can the diversity described in firsthand reports be represented by a seemingly homogeneous archaeological record? And the deeper I get into like this research, the harder it is for me to kind of narrow down into all the things I want to talk to you guys about. So I do have my little notes here to try to keep me on track. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening here. But my interests really lie in kind of re-examining the theories that past archaeologists couldn't test because the technology didn't exist to collect the right kind of data or run the necessary analytics. Specifically for this project, I propose using geometric morphometrics to reanalyze a single type of artifact that is found at almost every Toyah site, the Perdiz Point. Which is because I don't think that they are as uniform as Kelly once argued. And if they aren't uniform, then we can use these small variations to infer broader social connections between the people that occupied these Toyah sites. And this, let me see if the pointer works. This is a Perdiz Point. And its definition has remained pretty much the same since it was established by Kelly in the 1940s. Some of the key features we look for are in identifying our Perdiz Point are these kind of barbed shoulders. So these tangs that go downwards and this base here where it's hafted. The base here where it's hafted that kind of comes down to a point. But like really interestingly about the Perdiz points, and the pictures on the left side of the screen are really included in here. These are some of the Perdiz points that I've come across in my research. And they're interesting because a lot of them, and they're one of the few examples I've actually found, are made from flakes. So usually they're actually, once you kind of break the flake off of your core, they actually then only shape one side of it. So you can see in these pictures, you actually have like this curved shape to it. And a lot of people, like a lot of the questions that come up with this are like, how straight can this arrow actually fly? Or like, would this even be useful? But this middle picture here, that's why I wasn't pressing the right button. This middle picture here actually shows, I don't know how well you can tell on these monitors, but there was resharpening of this arrowhead. So it was used even though it was curved, and then it was resharpened to keep using it. Then this bottom picture here is an obsidian Perdiz point, which is the only obsidian point that I know of in the Perdiz style. It was found out at Center for Big Bend Studies excavation, just like, I think 2 or 3 months ago. So I'm actually really excited that I got to work with that one so quickly. The artifacts, the page on the right side of the screen is a page from a book called Stone Artifacts from Texas Indians by Turner et al., which I know most of you are probably super familiar with, since it's kind of the Bible on how to identify arrowheads in Texas. But I like to include this page because you can already see that there is a lot of variation in the overall shape, length, and size of these Perdiz points. But you can also see that that variation is sometimes small enough that like in our guts, we're like, yeah, that's different, but not necessarily able to provide a good explanation of why. And I chose to focus on Perdiz points, like besides them being just really cool tools. I chose to focus on Perdiz points for kind of 2 main reasons. The first is that they really are the most common Toyah artifact that's been collected. And I don't know if that frequency is because stone artifacts just don't degrade as much as the bones or pottery, or that it's just human nature to pick up the really cool arrowhead as opposed to small fragments of something else, like admittedly a little less cool looking. But whatever the reason, I estimate that there are around 1,000 to 2,000 Purdy's points that have been excavated across Texas. Secondly, archaeologists have actually been saying for decades that the Purdy's points aren't uniform. When I started this project, kind of like gathering all of my background research, I identified about 130 documents that describe excavations at Toyah sites. Published between 1946, which is the earliest mention I found, actually in the Dallas Archaeological Society record, which is kind of exciting for like this group, and 2020. And these documents range from everything from excavation reports to newsletters from local societies to CRM phase reports to dissertation and theses. So they really run the gambit of the ways you can tell someone about the archaeological site you worked at. But what I found was that buried deep in these reports, sometimes all the way back in the appendices, were one or two lines where the researcher says something along the lines of, these Purdy's points seem a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, a little bit wider than ones I've seen elsewhere. But without kind of a standard terminology to describe these changes, or really a regional database where all of these points were being compared at once, there was no way for a single archaeologist to know if their observations were indicative of a larger trend. And with that, we can transition to my research methodology. For this project, I'm working only with previously excavated materials, simply because that is the only feasible way a project of this regional scale can be done in enough time to get me graduated. But as part of building that Toyah research database that I mentioned, I first identified all the photographs of Purdy's points that had been published in reports, and then also the permitted repositories where the physical artifacts were being stored. And as I said, I estimate that anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Purdy's points have been excavated. I say estimate because a lot of reports don't give exact counts for their lithics, and it definitely doesn't account for a lot of the private collections that are being held and haven't been written yet. But so for the first phase of this project, I actually only focused on the pictures of Purdy's points that had been previously published. And I decided to use these images as a pilot study for my methodology because there were a little over 100 of these pictures. But also, I just really needed a way to keep making progress during the 2020 shutdowns of museums and universities because I couldn't travel due to COVID restrictions. And I won't go over the pilot study too much today unless there's some big interest in it or I have time left over and y'all want to ask questions. But the main kind of points I want to make from that are that I did indeed write code that work so the project can go forward, and that even with that small sample size of Purdy's points, I was already starting to see trends across Texas and changes in these shapes. So it was at least a promising start. The majority of the physical Purdy's points are split between 4 repositories. So TARL, the Texas Archaeological Research Laboratory in Austin, the Center for Archaeological Research at UT San Antonio, the Center for Big Bend Studies at Sul Ross, and the Archaeological Research Center at SMU. And I already had access to the SMU repository because I'd been working there. But this summer, I was able to travel with the support of the William P. Clements Center for Southwest Studies, the Council of Texas Archaeologists, and a grant established by the late archaeologist Fred Wendorf to the Center for Big Bend Studies and UTSA, and I'll be headed to TARL later this year. But I do want to say here how extraordinarily grateful I am for the network of curators, not just at these 4 facilities, but all over the state, because what I have found is that, especially in the older reports, the place where the researcher planned to put their artifacts is not always where it ended up. And so many wonderful people took time out of their day to check their inventories, go into their storage rooms, pull boxes, and it helped me track down and scan what ended up being over 750 Purdey's points that I'm using for this project. But then I have to get the data from these points. So I am using a series of tools which collectively are known as geometric morphometrics. And these are tools that were actually initially created to study evolutionary change in animals. So actually Abby, who's on Zoom now, she does this same kind of work to study the movement from wolves to dogs, like as the snouts get shorter and the teeth change. So you're still looking for variations in shape, but then archaeologists have kind of taken this technology to apply it to artifacts. And this is actually a pretty common form of analysis at universities in Europe and Asia. But in the United States, similar projects have been done on Clovis points in the Midwest. And for a lot of you, I'm sure you're pretty aware of Zach Selden's work at Stephen F. Austin with the Gahagan bifaces from East Texas Caddo. He's doing some really awesome work that he's able to actually use these geometric morphometrics instead of looking at like a regional study. He was able to even identify a single flint knapper. So like, these are pretty cool. Yeah, these are pretty cool technologies. Zach is actually the one who taught me how to use them, so I have to give him a plug. But so all of this geometric morphometrics begins with a two-dimensional image of a Purdey's point. And you can do this with a camera, but I chose to work with the Epson, just a flatbed scanner. This is actually just one I borrowed from our administrative assistant. And the reason I used an Epson scanner is because it always takes pictures from directly below, and it totally takes out the possible distortion for if someone like bumps your camera or something like that, and it's taking pictures at an angle. And then I need to collect measurements from these images. So traditional kind of like arrowhead studies focus on length, width, and height, three kind of measurements. But I use a combination of two existing packages in a coding language called R. And while there are computer softwares that will do similar analyses to the ones I'm going to describe, and don't require you to learn coding and write your own code, I did decide to go the coding route just because you can make more customizations to your analysis, and then all of the decisions you make are explicit and replicable in your lines of coding that you write. The first package I use is called Stereomorph. It was developed and maintained by Aaron Olson. And first, this creates an outline of each arrowhead. And all of my outlines are anchored by landmark points, which are just a way to tell the program how you want your outlines lined up for when you start doing analysis. So you're not trying to compare one point to an upside down point, because then the computer will be like, oh, these are super different, right? While the computer program allows you to place landmarks anywhere on a given image, I place mine at the tip, the base, and the end of the tang for each arrowhead, because these are all kind of like the defining places you look when you're wanting to identify what an arrowhead shape kind of category is. I will also note that Stereomorph is really surprisingly well suited for arrowhead analysis, because it actually connects dots using a series of curves, which are great for when you have scalloping from resharpening especially. Then I switch from Stereomorph to a package called Geomorph, which is where I gather my measurements and run my multivariate statistics. And again, there are a lot of really great packages out there. One of the most common ones being Momox, but at least for now, Geomorph is a lot more regularly updated, has someone super helpful on their help line when I email them with problems, and is just like a little more user-friendly. But in Geomorph, I can take hundreds of measurements. So not just the length, width, height, I'm looking at 120 measurements. So I get a much more exact representation of each individual shape and a lot more variables across which I can compare the shapes. And then there are a lot of different statistical kind of analyses that you can run to make these comparisons. And I know a lot of people that are doing this research switch over to SPSS software to do that, But for this project, and just for simplicity's sake, and because geomorph will do it, I stay in geomorph and use to do generalized Procrustes analyses and Procrustes ANOVAs, which I did just have to learn like really what they do, because it's complicated. Statistics are hard. But all of this up until now just gets us a series of numbers on a computer. And to interpret them, we need theoretical frameworks. And these frameworks are really just a defined set of assumptions about human behavior and how we kind of take those inferences about that human behavior and connect it to the artifacts that we have. And so I actually work a lot with a framework called communities of practice. And this just defines a phenomenon where craftsmen of any type, so artists, potters, flint knappers, as they spend time together, sharing tips and tricks in their creative process, they will start to make things that look very similar. And it's the same kind of logic that art historians use to trace painters who apprenticed at the same school. But in this case, what I can assume is that the more similar the Perdise points from two different sites are, then the more time the people who lived at those sites must have spent together. But for this project, I wanted to go like one step further, because as we established, I like going that extra mile. And so I'm not looking at just two sites. I want to look across the entire state. And to do this, I ran 3 different analyses, each one kind of dividing the Texas region in a different way. So first, I grouped these sites according to natural regions. So for example, like the Edwards Plateau versus the Gulf Coast versus hill country. And then the second spatial variable was along river basins. And this is because there is significant literature that documents ancient people from all over the world clustering along river banks. And then the final variable will be along the boundaries that outline the descendant communities' claims to traditional lands. And these are the same, to get this data, I actually just used the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's the same maps we use when we want to repatriate NAGPRA artifacts to the tribes that they belong to. And right now I am still in the data collection phase. So I have scanned all of my arrowheads and I'm now starting to run them through my geomorph programs. So I don't actually know what patterns will eventually emerge, right? This is the mystery that I leave you guys with. But based on the results of my pilot study, I do expect to actually see the most variation in shape between the river valleys. But personally, I am most excited about the comparisons between traditional lands, because this is the best proxy that I can think of that connects the indigenous oral histories, the Spanish writings, and the archaeological findings. So while the thing I kind of like to leave people with when I talk about my dissertation is that the modern Texas identity is undeniably shaped by our Spanish colonial influences, from the food we eat to the fact that the Alamo is like the most visited landmark in the state. But the way we talk about this collective history often fails to acknowledge just how amazingly complex the networks of the indigenous groups who were here when the Spanish arrived really were. And the amazing thing about archaeology is that we have the opportunity to kind of tell those forgotten stories using the artifacts they left behind. And especially in periods like 18th century Texas, where there were two such disparate groups of people colliding, I've found that the story really only gets more interesting the more complexity we allow. Thank you. I admit I was a little nervous for this, so.
That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does
Okay.
anyone?
Yeah. And just a reminder, if
Yeah.
folks ask a question in person, try to repeat
Repeat
it
it.
for the folks on Zoom.
Will do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are you using for primary source material aside from just the archaeology?
Awesome. Okay. So the question is about primary, I'm guessing like the historical document kind of situation. It's interesting. So mostly I'm using pre-existing translations. So I mentioned Mariah Wade's master's thesis because I actually haven't found a better document. Because it just really goes through all of them. It is kind of interesting, like when you start dealing with colonial Spanish documents, because I was a classicist in a past life, and there they will spend days debating how to translate like and here we just kind of gloss over and say like, this is our translation. But I found like Mariah Wade's really been pretty reliable. There are also books from like the 40s and 50s that go through a lot of like these stories and this history, but those have kind of the problem of any historical document where they're super biased sometimes and can say some pretty racially charged kind of statements. And they just really totally ignore, like, they're all about what the Spanish were observing and 0% about what the indigenous people would actually have told them. Does that kind of get at it?
Yeah, so just a quick part, at SMU, do you guys have access to historical text, the historical text database?
We have some, but if you have one you love, I would always love to learn more.
I'll catch it.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, so you mentioned you've got an assemblage 750 or more of these points.
Yeah.
First slide sort of frame that from a chronological perspective over a period of about 600 years.
Yeah.
Do those 750 points cover the entirety of that period of time? And if they do, is sort of a happy byproduct of this looking at the development of these points through time?
Awesome. So this is actually, this is the exact question that my dissertation advisor always asks me to. So the question was, because this is such like a broad range of time, can the arrowheads that I have analyze both space and time, basically?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes, kind of, which is just because once Purdy's points became like a temporal marker of like, oh, we're in a Purdy's stratigraphic layer, we're in a Toyah stratigraphic layer, then it becomes like the time marker in and of itself that like you wouldn't then, a lot of people didn't then go and do extra radiocarbon dating. So a lot of times really what we know is it's after the Austin focus, but like before metal arrowheads. Which makes it a little bit harder. So I have kind of danced around that a little bit. But when we do have about half of these have radiocarbon dates attached, so it gets to it a little bit. Yeah.
You mentioned that you've only found one obsidian
Yes.
point. Now, my guess is that there are dozens of them out there, okay?
Yes.
And you may find them in the course of this, even though you may not use it in your dissertation.
Yes.
But raw material is a fact that you haven't mentioned at all. And across that area, you run from a very crude quartzite on the east to, and in central Texas, well,
Yeah.
to a nice chert in some areas. How is that affecting your
The analysis.
perspective?
Yeah. So the obsidian, so the question was kind of like connecting all of this back to raw material type. And it is like a really important kind of concept to explore because like the quartzite, like you mentioned, is way harder to make a good point than the really good like Edwards Plateau chert. And so it does kind of, it actually kind of gets handled by these measurements because you will naturally start to see those changes, like because an obsidian is going to break so much more predictably than a chert with inclusions or a quartzite that you can kind of look back and see like there's an outlier here, what was it made of? And so it's kind of like my secondary go to once I start to identify the clusters. And a lot of it is also because like we can do the macro analyses of the chert. Like we can look at the color and we can look at the inclusions, but you can't do the same kind of chemical analyses as as reliably as you can do with an obsidian, where you can get like, this is my source of obsidian, just because chert is kind of that smushed together rock that has so many pieces to it. So that's kind of my answer there. Does that kind of cover it?
Yes, but at the same time, 750 arrowheads over an area the size of Texas
Yes.
is
Not
a
a
pretty skinny sample.
Yes.
To hang anything talking about the relationship between your sites
Yes.
and indigenous people and tying them down, is it not?
So I do. So part of it is like, yes, definitely. It is about half of what I predict like are the known pretties points. So like in that way, it's a pretty good subset of what I think we know. But I did, and I guess I didn't talk about this, but I try to really not work at sites that had less than 10 pretties points, like from that immediate area, just to kind of keep that. You're not going to be able to say there's a cluster here if there's just 1 or 2 points, right? Like a connecting line between 2 points is just a line. So I do, that is something that I try to account for in that collection phase. But that is also kind of hard because there are sites, there's so many sites and there's so many good pretties points that we were like, there's 1 here, maybe 2. So it's more just a fact that I just kind of have to try to work around. The good thing about Procruste's analyses in general is that the way they kind of check and they kind of run through cycles, it actually kind of works like a statistical model where there is like a predictive aspect to it, where it would kind of say like the likelihood of this being like a pretty solid cluster is this, which I know isn't like the most satisfactory answer, but it's sometimes all we have to work with.
No, it's worth pursuing.
Yes, I mean, I do. There was a project in, I think the early 2000s that just compared 2 sites in the Gulf Coast. And because they were just at 2 sites, like they were able to really focus in on like dozens of pretties points from each site. And they did find kind of like that mathematical language to talk about these variations in shape. And so I guess that's really a lot more also what we're working towards, is this doesn't have to be like the be all end all. But it kind of takes us 1 step closer to solving it.
Okay, well, let's hop into Zoom. We've got some questions waiting there, and James will help us.
I've got 3 questions and 1 comment. The comment is from Tim Perdola, who says there was an obsidian point found at 41 AN 201, which was a 16th to 17th century Caddo site. So
I think that's actually an SMU, like we have that.
okay, I'll give you the number.
Yes, thank you.
Then we've got 3 people, 2 with their hands up, and then also Tim Dalby. So let's start with Dan, who was the first I saw to raise a hand. Can he hear us, Dan?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask a question. So you're saying you can use for this analysis pictures from both reports and images that you scan on that scanner for this analysis? Like you can go back into the old reports and do that kind of morphometric analysis?
Yes, so the problem with working in like these 2 kind of different types of photograph are that the older photographs, like they are copies of copies of copies. So you're getting much less resolution. But at the same time, because I'm focused on the outline of these points, they do still provide like a pretty interesting kind of set to include. I have at this point only done the photographs from reports. I haven't kind of thrown those in together with like the physical artifacts that I've looked at. So there is totally the chance that they might self-separate. In which case I lose 100 points, but gain a lot more knowledge, so.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have some samples if you want to use them.
Very much.
Yeah,
Always.
I'll get in contact.
Thank you.
Right. Abigail Fisher.
Hi, Abby.
Hi, Bonnie. Do you have a criteria that you use? I promise it's not a geometric morphometric question.
I was gonna
Do you
say,
have a criteria that you use to reject points that somebody has called a Perdise point, but when you come and see it, it is not actually what, and I apologize for Rue, this is the only way he won't help.
no, this is, this, Abby and I are at the same dissertation program, so I'm very certain you just did this to help me out, because this is actually something I love to talk about. And something that I've thought a lot about, because if there's a cluster, like the easiest explanation for it would be to just say like, oh, it's because you have just a different type, right? Like it's not even a Perdise point, that's why it's separated. And there are two kind of parts to this. So the first one being, I'm only using absolutely whole Perdise points. So it has to have the tip, the base, the tangs, all of it. So we're working with like the best kind of picture perfect sample. The second part of this is what I'm using is less, and it's kind of the way typologies work in general, right? It's less the idea that this is definitely provably a Perdise point, and it's more any reasonable archaeologist would look at this and say probably. And I included this slide just in case this came up. But so this is a slide I had made to talk about my pilot study, but I like it because this picture up here, this is a photo of all the outlines of Perdise points that have been published in an archaeological report. And you can see that there's a lot of variation, and then kind of what the program has done is the darkest outline there is what the average is, what an ideal point would look like. And so if my criteria is, would a reasonable archaeologist look at this and say this is a Perdise point, then I can also plug whatever point it is into this kind of clustering and say, yes, based on all the other times an archaeologist has said this is a Perdise point, it does fall kind of within that range. So that's kind of like the twofold answer. The third fold, if you want to get super complicated, a lot of times this question then turns into, well, how useful are these typologies? And that's because a lot of kind of the first people to be doing geometric morphometric analyses with artifacts, and especially with stone tools like Bob Dunnell and Lee Lyman, they were very much in the mindset of get rid of all the old typologies because my research can replace it with a great new mathematical cluster of artifacts. But I think that kind of archaeologists are, all researchers really, all humans can be a little too quick to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater on that one, like in favor of a shiny new technology, because like when I mention a Perdise point, all of you can look back at the Turner et al. Book, or like you already have a picture in your head of what that Perdise point kind of is. So it's just a good common language to use. But since Kelly excavated these points, there have been like hundreds, if not thousands more Perdise points found. So that isn't to say we couldn't tighten the definition of what a Perdise point is, or double check that we're not kind of throwing points in that shouldn't really be there. Does that kind of get to it, Abby?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Bonnie.
In a way overcomplicated way.
As we do.
Yes.
And Tim Galvey has had several comments he wanted to make about Perdise and Alba. So,
I love it. Yeah.
Tim, are you still there?
Yeah, I had to unmute myself. I wanted to be good.
All right, what comments or questions would you like to throw out here?
Oh, I don't know. If Toyah is the Perdiz, what's an Alba-2?
I actually don't, man, now you stumped me. I actually don't know. Yeah, I can't add to that. There is an answer. I am super certain. I just don't have it.
Are you familiar with Dan McGregor did an analysis on Joe Pool sites, and he looked at Perdiz and Alba, and he found an intermediary between the two in terms of size and morphometrics, so to speak, but he wasn't doing any fancy statistical package like you're proposing.
Yes, so actually I've been super fortunate to work with Dan McGregor because SMU was part of the Joe Pool excavation. So we actually we have been trying for, I think, 3 decades now to make sure the right artifacts are in the right repository, and we have yet to fully accomplish it. So many times I have met to trade boxes of artifacts with Dan McGregor. But also because of those analysis he did have like a perfect box of like Perdiz points to be able to be like, yes, Bonnie, here, which is always delightful. But that kind of like intermediary point is actually not uncommon. So another super common one is actually the Whitney point. So you'll see a lot of lithics reports will actually say Perdiz hyphen Whitney. And so his would say like Perdiz hyphen Alba. So it's not uncommon, but I think that's more of that trying to find that common language to say like, there's a difference, but I'm not sure, like, I can't do better to describe it than to say like, it also looks like this.
One more, I'll leave you alone.
I love it. No, this is awesome.
Back in the 80s, Zeiss had a program that you could do for digitizing, and it measured stuff like the total peripheral metrics and any kind of measurement you wanted to do. Does your programs do that for size? Because I did a bunch of work on some artifacts, and I thought that area and parameter and peripheral and all that was much more meaningless than length, width, and thickness.
Yeah, so there is, so like, are you talking like, there's the program where they would kind of like draw like an oval around the arrowhead?
That would measure, the camera would measure every so many pixels around the edge of the artifact, whatever it was, and it would.
Oh, it cut off. I will say, like, now that you've described it, like, I do know what you're talking about, and it's actually really just kind of an updated version of that. But instead of using the outline line as your point of measurement, it's using like cross cuts of the arrowhead for exactly that reason, that these outlines, it's so difficult to compare when you're trying to talk about like, well, this point has some scalloped edges, this point kind of curves in, like those don't really get captured when you're trying to do those area kind of outline measurements, but they do get captured when you start like making cross sections.
Right, does Zach's program do that kind of thing?
It does. This is exactly Zach's program, actually. Zach taught me his program, and then I just kind of kept running with it. And we slightly diverged at this point, but still basically the same thing. He adds in 3D scanning a lot of times. And there is actually some really cool work. Philip Fisher up at Washington State did a really interesting, he calls it topography of a point, where he actually looks at kind of the dips made from flaking off when you're making a point. And he uses that to talk about actually the exact like one after the other flake process that an individual maker would do. But it kind of gets to the same question of like the end product and the way you get there.
Oh yeah, these programs, you can take the area of, like if you've got cortex, you can measure the area of cortex You
Yes.
can measure different flakes, you can measure different base, you can do all kinds of stuff.
Yes, it's kind of amazing, like, and it just gets faster and faster to run these analyses. Like, I don't need to go to a supercomputer. My regular old laptop can now run what it, like, in 2 minutes, what it would have taken 2 days to run not even 5 years ago. So it's kind of amazing, like, where this technology is headed, and especially with how fast and like the price of 3D scanning is just dropping and dropping and dropping. So I expect that like this will be old hat in 5 years and we'll be totally onto something new. But I guess like the old adage of like, may you live long enough to see your dissertation disproved. It's not a bad thing if someone makes some cool advances after me.
Well, it'd be nice if everybody in archaeology who has to do with metrics gets a copy of Bookstein's book back in 1980s on morphometrics.
Yes, I even still use it, so
It's good.
it's a good book.
Yeah.
Any other questions on Zoom?
One last one came in. Tim Perdola asked for a little more information about the Whitney point, like where are they found?
Oh, okay. I am diving deep into my
That's new to me too.
memory here. The Whitney points, I think, are actually, if I'm remembering right, and I definitely like would have to double check, but I think they're a Gulf Coast point. And I also, so like part of this statement is that the one major hole I have in my arrowhead kind of collection is I think I have only like 2 or 3 sites that can kind of be clustered into the Gulf region. So that is definitely like a hole in what I've been able to collect, which doesn't necessarily mean it's like a real hole out there in the world. It's just what I've been able to get access to, but I think it's a Gulf Coast, maybe a South Texas, but if I keep guessing, we'll just get to all regions of Texas.
Okay. Any other questions on the floor here in person? Okay. Any other from folks on Zoom? In comment or otherwise?
I'll just say that we had 48 Zoom participants outside of this room. So 48 plus the folks who were in here. Glenn, what's? How many? 31.
I will say I did invite my family, so
Great.
I was kind of excited to show off. Like, this is kind of the first time I've gotten to do this in a while. Like, there haven't been in-person talks, and I definitely don't get to talk. SMU just doesn't have the same like Texas focus that it used to. So we really don't have a professor there that can be like, let me check you on this kind of knowledge. So this has been awesome for me. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie. Great job. All right, folks, with that, I will wish everybody a great night. And remember, December, no monthly meeting, but we have the Christmas party on December 10th. We also have some other opportunities to do other activities, and we will resume meetings in January. So thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you for your service.
All right, everybody on Zoom, thanks for joining. Y'all have a great night out there.